Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beaker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Nebraska History Museum on the third Thursday of each month. A detailed schedule of this series, as well as information about Historical Society activities and programs, can be found at our website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Our presenter today is Catherine Biba. The title of her talk is Wrecked in a Night, Rebuilt in a Day, Omaha After the Easter Sunday Tornado. Catherine is a PhD candidate at Cornell University. She was raised in Geneva and is a 2007 University of Nebraska graduate. And she will share with us today that how the recovery of Omaha back then was seen differently from that of natural disasters today. Catherine.
Thanks for joining me on this rainy, cool day. I get a little worried that I'm perhaps conjuring terrible weather whenever I talk about this subject, because in March I was on a panel for the 100th anniversary and there was a blizzard after they'd predicted an inch of snow. So hopefully that will not repeat today. Anyway, we'll go ahead and get started here. 2/3 of the way through March 1913, Omaha cartoonist Doane Powell sat down to draw the featured cartoon for the Omaha Bee. Perhaps he sat at his desk, contemplating his options. Sunday was Easter, he should probably mention that. Newly appointed Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan and his wife were back in the state for a visit, and they had a busy day lined up for them in Omaha. Was there some mild humor there? And the weather, well, that was always ripe for commentary. The weather had been unusually miserable that month, Powell thought, featuring the unhappy combination of colder than average temperatures and higher than average precipitation. The latest blizzard, on March 20th, supposedly the first day of spring, left drifts taller than a man in the central part of the state. That settled it, Powell decided. He'd give his fellow winter-weary Nebraskans a laugh at the expense of their shared meteorological misery. And so he began to draw. Many bee readers no doubt chuckled to themselves at Powell's whimsical cartoon that morning when they turned their attention to the Sunday paper. A young woman dressed in Easter finery and a fantastical floral hat symbolized Easter as she turned the crank on a complex machine labeled March. Old Lion Winter roared as he disappeared into a chute at the top of the machine. And then Powell's punchline. Omaha, a slightly stocky man in a trench coat and bowler hat, peered expectantly into the empty production end of the machine and wondered, "Ain't there a-goin' to be no lamb?" In a bit of tragic prescience, Powell's cartoon anticipated the decidedly unlamb-like weather that visited Omaha that evening. Around 6 p.m. on Easter Sunday, March 23, 1913, a massive tornado ripped through Omaha, decimating homes of both rich and poor residents of the city, leaving thousands homeless, hundreds injured, and over 100 dead. The tornado first touched down in the southwest part of town, continued to the northeast, and was especially destructive around the intersection of 24th and Lake Streets before it finally crossed the Missouri River into Iowa. You can see I've labeled on this map where Dodge Street is down at the bottom, and 24th and Lake Street is further up at the top, to kind of give you a bearing with modern-day Omaha. Part of a massive storm system that spawned other deadly tornadoes in Nebraska that night, notably in Ralston, Utan, and Berlin, which is now called Oto, and caused devastating flooding in Ohio 2 days later, the tornado left a path of wreckage so profound that many who later saw it expressed amazement that anyone in the storm's path had survived. But many did survive and rebuilt their lives, and the city did too. Before we look at the aftermath of the storm and how recovery happened for the city, I want to take a few minutes to give you a rundown of what Omaha was like before the storm hit. Today, Omaha is known for many things. A nice zoo, the College World Series, Warren Buffett, But in 1913, Omaha was yet a young city and a young state, filled with ambitious entrepreneurs trying to cement their place in the national economy. The white settlement in the area began officially in 1846 when migrating Mormons en route to Utah set up winter quarters on the bluffs overlooking the Missouri River. Growth of the city did not begin in earnest until it secured the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad and saw construction begin in 1866. Securing the eastern terminus of the Union Pacific's portion of the railway over competitors like Sioux City, Kansas City, and St. Joseph, Missouri, was achieved through a powerful cocktail of boosterism, political machinations, and the business interests of influential men. But the triumph seemed to cement Omaha's importance as a western city, as the gate to the west. The railroad connection meant that Omaha's first boom came as a railroad worker and supply camp, and with that attendant unsavory connotations. One Kansas City paper labeled it a very cesspool of iniquity. If you're a student of Omaha or Nebraska history, you've no doubt run across the disgustful posy Harper's Magazine printed in 1869 about the objectionable region, featuring several colorful stanzas, including, "Hast ever been in Omaha, where whiskey shops the livelong night are vending out their poison juice, where men are often very tight and women deemed a trifle loose, where taverns have an anxious guest for every corner, shelf, and crack, with half the people going west and all the others going back. If it lies upon your way, for God's sakes, reader, go around it." The city indeed fostered an impressive proliferation of saloons and brothels, and thus began a wide-open reputation that remained even after so-called legitimate business dominated the city landscape. Whether Omaha actually was the Gomorrah of the Missouri, or whether it fell victim to prevailing ideas of what it meant to be a western city at that time, there's evidence that its vice activities faced very little real opposition to their existence and flourished accordingly. Economically, the city blossomed in the 4 decades after the completion of the railroad. A number of advantages worked in the young city's favor. Its early position on the Transcontinental Railroad secured connection to nearly every market or major city and allowed it to develop into a transportation and shipping hub. Nebraska and the rest of the Great Plains were being rapidly settled and farmed, resulting in a robust agricultural hinterland. The cattle grazing in the Western Plains and Rocky Mountain region were similarly situated to feed into Omaha, and its location in the very middle of the country gave it potential as an entry point to the west from the east. The city's population grew from 140,590 in 1900 to 168,546 in the 1910 census. Probably grew more than that. There is widespread speculation that the 1900 census figures were inflated fairly considerably by city boosters. So they may have actually had an even greater growth than that if the 1910 figures are accurate. Like many American cities around the turn of the century, Omaha's official power structure was undergirded by a powerful political machine, in this case headed by a man named Tom Denison. The machine's favorite candidate for mayor, James Cowboy Jim Dahlman, won his first mayoral election in 1906, and he served almost continuously until his death in office in 1930, losing only one election and gaining the moniker the wettest mayor in America for his tolerance and enjoyment of saloons. If you were here at last month's lecture about cowboys, you probably heard a little bit about Dahlman's cowboy past. He was a pretty interesting character, and he definitely played this cowboy, rugged frontiersman character pretty successfully as a political tool. By 1913, Omaha was mostly considered a success. True early booster dreams of becoming the next Chicago or even outstripping the great city had not come to pass. But more modest aims of becoming a regional power and perhaps becoming the second city to the second city seemed either fulfilled or within reasonable reach. Business associations proliferated, some focusing on specific industries like real estate, while others sought a broader base. The largest and most influential, the Commercial Club, published a weekly journal devoted to promoting the club's interests, and this often meant looking to the eastern United States. In some ways, this is to be expected. The men who made up Omaha's business leadership were usually from somewhere else, or at the very least, sons of men who came to Omaha from other parts of the United States, or even the world. This background made them especially able to remember that Omaha's existence and their profits depended on maintaining nationwide links. Although their livelihoods were made in the West, political power, financial backing, and revenue streams often came from the East. Fiercely protective of the city's reputation, and by extension their own business prospects, the club urged its members to be aware of any news of Omaha in the wider world, both positive and negative, and obsessively cataloged its own press clippings. Members were also to be on the lookout for any slights against the city. And the journal, I quote, "Whether at home or abroad, every member should be watchful to see wherein Omaha may be discriminated against, either in trade, mail, freight, or passenger service, market or weather reports, or anything else. Anything amiss should be reported." At that point, I think they would send a strongly worded corrective to either a newspaper, if it was a newspaper that had printed the damning evidence, or to an individual, if it was something an individual had said. The perceived economic importance of a strong national reputation shaped the work of the club and its interactions outside the city, and after the tornado, it influenced the path of relief and recovery as well. All right, so back to the tornado, which you probably all came here to hear. This is purported to be a photograph of the tornado as it passed through Omaha by a man named T.C. Manning, who clearly had a taste for photographic risk. And I don't know, if he was alive today, he probably wouldn't be Instagramming pictures of food. He'd probably be, I don't know, maybe he'd be a videographer on Shark Week or something. But he definitely had a flair for risk. The tornado's damage transcended economic classes, and the path that it cut across Omaha revealed a cross-section of Omaha society. Many of the grandest homes in the city, in the Bemis Park neighborhood, were damaged, including the Brandeis House and Jocelyn Castle. The castle, for its part, withstood the storm reasonably well, but the extravagant greenhouse was scattered across the grounds and was never restored to its former glory. Here's a few pictures of some of the larger homes in what they called the fashionable district. And so you can see that they sustained a fair amount of damage in that area. The most fatalities occurred farther along the storm's path, near 24th and Lake, an area of the city home to many Jewish families and more recent European immigrants. The Krinsky family was among the dead, and their tragic demise garnered countless retellings in newspapers and souvenir retrospectives of the storm. Nathan Krinsky, a baker who lived with his wife and 5 children above his shop, perished along with every member of his family when the building was obliterated by the winds. The Krinskys became an exemplar of the storm, a shorthand for the devastation and suffering suffered by those in the tornado district. The Commercial Club of Omaha used their specific case to illustrate the call to arms circulated in their group's newsletter, and even termed them a typical case. You can see in the bottom caption. While calling them typical was thankfully an overstatement of the situation, the family's fate struck a powerful chord in many Omahans. Omaha's African American community suffered as well. As you can see from this photo, many black families lost their homes and several individuals lost their lives. As city leaders and main newspapers promoted a rhetoric of unity in the wake of the storm, black storm victims were still marginalized in various ways. Victims from this part of town were enumerated in the lists of dead that appeared daily in the major newspapers, though the label colored was always included immediately after the victim's name, a common journalistic convention of this time period. Though the relief stations scattered throughout the city were thrown open to anyone, at least in theory, the black community soon opened a relief station of its own, which may indicate that the treatment through official channels was not entirely satisfactory. Quote, "The colored people have established their own relief station at 24th and Burdett Streets, where they are aiding their own people as rapidly as possible," the Omaha Bee reported several days after the storm. "There are no lines drawn, however, and colored people are given relief at the regular stations as regularly as they make application," the paper hastened to add, which may or may not have reflected reality. While white victims from the storm were distributed to all of the funeral homes in the city, segregation meant that all of the African American dead went to OB's funeral home, which served the black community. Because of a shortage of hearses, several victims' coffins were transported to their final resting place on the back of a truck. You can see on the bottom. The case of the Krinskys was oft-quoted, and it was equaled in infamy only by the case of the Idlewild Pool Hall. And these are some of the victims of that Idlewild Pool Hall. Mostly patronized by African Americans, the pool hall collapsed and then caught on fire before being doused by the storm's rain, resulting in a particularly grisly excavation scene. Death toll reports at the establishment varied from 10 to 25, but in any event, it was the building in the city that had the most fatalities. Either because of the nature of the establishment or because of the race of the victims, or possibly both, the Idlewild deaths received a moralistic interpretation in some sources. One paper reported that one victim's body was supposedly recovered still grasping tightly a roll of dollar bills, a detail that not so subtly indicated the dead man's fatal proclivity for gaming. Do you see all the people in the background of this photo? Well, here we go. There we go. It's a little blurry, but you can see that this is a very, very crowded scene, and this is at the Idlewild Pool Hall. Believe it or not, all of these people are not helping with the excavation scene. They're probably kind of in the way, as a matter of fact. They're kind of just checking it out. In the days following the storm, sightseeing in the storm district was a hugely popular pastime. On March 28th, so later in the week, the Omaha Bee reported that thousands of visitors from Iowa, Nebraska, and other states were arriving on every train into the city. This apparently had already been going on for several days, because the day after the storm, the Omaha Daily News claimed that crowds were an unruly nuisance. Officers shouted incessantly, "Move on," but the crowds did not decrease, the paper explained. So fruitless were the police's demands that they requested additional reinforcements before noon on Monday, due to an inability to handle and control the crowds. But if the sightseeing crowds were an inconvenience, they were ultimately relatively harmless. Not so, however, the looters. Fear of looting, crime, and disorder haunted many Omahans in the days following the tornado. Such fears are not uncommon in the wake of disasters, and disaster historians even have a term for this, and they call it elite panic. Sometimes the fears are based in reality, looting does happen, and sometimes they're exaggerated in order to justify especially restrictive measures on a populace. But there is a common feature of this sort of fear always being there. In the wake of a disaster, actions can easily be misconstrued. In a chaotic and unsettled atmosphere, it's easy to misread a situation and make the wrong call and assume the worst, which can complicate the issue. Omaha authorities fully expected criminal elements to rise to the surface in the wake of the storm. The chief of police proactively telegraphed a dozen larger cities in the region, like St. Louis and Minneapolis, to beg some detectives on loan for a few days, as he was, quote, expecting a great influx of that human carrion that lives on the men and women who have met with misfortune. In the days following the tornado, the daily newspapers were filled with reports of looting. Herman Bloom told the Daily News on Monday morning that he had spotted two separate incidents late on Sunday night, so this was just right after the tornado, after search and rescue teams had dwindled. I saw two looters at different times, he said. I saw them carrying away some things from my neighbor's barn. The World Herald was especially devoted to bringing the public news of looting, reporting on the 27th two separate incidents. One involved a man kicking in the window of a house in broad daylight while the homeowner's wife fled to a neighbor's, and ransacking it from cellar to garret. The other confrontation became violent when police exchanged shots with marauders attempting to rob an elegant home in the Bemis Park neighborhood in the middle of the night. Such moments of chaos and disorder were completely antithetical to the goals and visions of the Citizens Relief Committee. By the end of the week, the relief effort was a tangle of committees, subcommittees, executive committees, and interest groups, all devoted to helping victims or certain subsets of victims recover from the storm. But chief among them all was the Citizens Relief Committee, a group of 50 men and women considered to be leading citizens of Omaha. The CRC oversaw the distribution of supplies to needy applicants for aid, the disbursement of funds collected throughout the week, the staffing of the official relief stations throughout the city, as well as sundry other tasks, such as answering replies from panicked relatives who would telegraph the city looking for information about loved ones. They turned the city auditorium into a receiving center for donated goods, where they fumigated textiles to kill off scarlet fever and other diseases, and then redistributed the clothing and household goods to victims. Here you can see some of that going on. The picture on the right has piles of clothing that were donated, and over here we've got some of the food that is set up as a soup kitchen for victims. The City Auditorium housed the soup kitchen, and it served as a temporary shelter. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era marked a time in American history when efficiency and professionalization were very much in vogue. In the last decade of the 19th century and early in the 20th, Americans in various sectors of society, those in the business world and reform movements most notably, obsessed over the idea of eliminating all possible waste and inefficiency. True products of their time, the CRC members approached the problem of relief in an almost scientific way. Tabulations of every sort recorded what was donated and by whom. A system of cards, we'll go back to the Krinsky family here, like the one printed in the Commercial Club's journal, were to be filled out completely by aid workers who canvassed the city to find what they termed the truly needy. Words like system and efficient litter descriptions of the committee's work. And here you can see how completely thorough they were. They, in theory, filled out one of these for anyone who lost a home or lost a business or anything like that, every individual or family. And so they're putting down the name, the location, the state of the house, what district. They divided this in so they had a way of cataloging who the victims were, next of kin, what their needs were, and so very, very thorough in their efforts here. The Commercial Club's journal's approving description encapsulates the spirit of the CRC. Quote, "The relief work is being conducted in a most systematic and businesslike manner through the use of triplicate requisitions filled out by the manager of each field stations and honored at the main supply depot, located in the auditorium, where Captain Stritzinger acts as quartermaster." So it was like a combination of the military and a machine and just pretty much every ordered process that one could think of is what they tried to emulate in their relief efforts. In an effort to combat, or at least manage, the looting and sightseeing, the state militia and the police tried to secure the Storm District, and the city enacted a pass system, wherein residents had to go to City Hall to apply for a pass to get into the secure area and back to their own property. As you'll recall from the map I showed you earlier, the so-called stricken district was rather large, a pretty sizable chunk of the city, so in practice this didn't work entirely as well as they hoped. The intentions behind the pass system were probably good ones, but it likely ended up unduly burdening people who had already suffered or lost everything. If you've kind of lost your house, you kind of want to go back and see like what's there, what's left for you, maybe dig through the rubble a little bit, see if you can find any pictures or anything. But before you can do that, you have to get yourself down to City Hall, get yourself a pass, kind of somehow prove who you are and that you have a reason to be in this tornado area. And then go back, show a military or a policeman, here's my card, here's my pass, and then you can go and dig through your belongings. In the end, the committee helped hundreds of families, dispersed countless articles of clothing and household goods, and managed many thousands of dollars in contributions. So, in spite of some of their red tape here, they did manage to do quite a bit of good in relieving suffering. But those thousands of dollars in financial contributions proved to be a point of major contention in the week after the tornado. I'm going to spend a little time here talking about where the money came from for relief efforts and what the implications of charity were at this time, because it's something that's hotly debated in our present time when things like Hurricane Katrina or Superstorm Sandy decimate an area. Tom mentioned in his introduction to the talk that one of the reasons this is so interesting is because it is so very, very different than what happens in our time. As I'm sure you all remember from Hurricane Katrina or Superstorm Sandy, you know, the presence of the federal government is very, very, very visible. And when FEMA doesn't show up as quickly or as fully as people think that it should, that becomes a major, major talking point. And so there's definitely an expectation that there's going to be that states will take care of disaster-stricken areas, and then that the larger state, the federal government, will in turn also help restore things back to their previous condition. That expectation does not really exist at that time. A lot of people think, oh, the New Deal, that's when federal intervention in disasters started. that's a bit of an oversimplification. Federal government actually was giving money for disaster relief even back to the 1780s, although the New Deal was certainly an unprecedentedly large use of the federal government to relieve suffering. But in 1913, even with that history of relief, the expectation was just totally, totally different. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that. So where did the money come from? Much of the money came from the donations of individuals. Giving to the relief effort was a highly public affair, thanks to the newspapers, as anyone who donated to the storm relief funds found their names printed in the paper along with the amount of their contribution. Businesses and individuals gave, with amounts ranging from portions of $1 to hundreds or even thousands of dollars. The so-called People's Paper, the Omaha Daily News, lavished praise on elite citizens who quickly donated money after the tornado. "Rich men give liberally," ran the first subline from Monday's story about relief. "Wealthy men open their purses," it declared in response to the feeling of pity and sympathy that resided in every heart. So stirred were the members of the CRC by these elite benefactors, many of whom were, in fact, on the CRC, that they issued a statement gushing that human kindness found ready expression and purse strings were loosened, willing hands were extended, buildings, schools, and homes were offered, and in every way the meeting of the CRC demonstrated that the strong men of the city are equal to any emergency. These strong men, who were specially favored with wealth, claimed they would spare no expense in alleviating the suffering of the storm victims. Apparently, to whom much was given, much was expected. But in spite of this emphasis on elite giving, ordinary citizens contributed too, and papers gleefully printed letters from those giving what little they had, inviting comparisons to the New Testament parable of the widow's mite and praising the community spirit of Omahans. The newspapers also invoked a sense of duty when clamoring for donations, relying on survivor guilt to inspire giving. Omahans had few qualms about accepting donations from their fellow citizens and seemed to even expect it, viewing donation as almost a duty of those who had not been affected by the storm. "If you have seen the wreckage, you know that there are many in need," admonished State Senator J.H. Millard before donating an impressive $2,500. On March 27th, cartoonist Doane Powell, our friend from the beginning of this talk, drew another cartoon for the Bee, again emphasizing the city's responsibility to its own. If you look at this diverse list, we've got a needy family there in the middle of the page, and they're surrounded by all of the people who are expected to be helping. Mr. Corman, Mr. Richman, City Council, the school board, Miss School Teacher, Military Aide, Lincoln, State Legislature, Mr. Every Husband, Mrs. Every Wife. If you look down here at the bottom, then we've got personified those people who are supposed to be helping. Mr. Every Man, Mrs. Every Woman, and even, Powell implicated, children could help. Because here we have baby Every Child offering her doll to a child victim of the storm. The duty to do one's part emphasized the capriciousness of calamity. If the storm's path had veered only a few blocks to the left or a few blocks to the right, those currently enjoying intact homes and healthy families might easily have found themselves in the situation of their neighbors now suffering. The "but for the grace of God, there go I" message played on ideas of reciprocity and the ingrained lessons of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Yet another cartoon graphically illustrated this message, depicting two families, one disheveled, cold, miserable, inside the storm district, and the other warm, safe, and happy outside of harm's way. The caption emphasized that the victims in this case were destitute through no fault of their own, and that those who were safe were yet enjoying their health and families through no special virtue of their own. All of these exhortations for giving worked well, and by April 3rd, the General Relief Fund contained $181,900 and was still growing. I should add that in addition to individuals, it was very common for cities to be sending each other, from commercial clubs from other cities or on behalf of the city council to be sending donations as well. And here again, the idea of reciprocity shows back up. So there are donations made from San Francisco, which had the horrible earthquake in 1906, Johnstown, which had a terrible flood in 1880-something. And with those donations, they often noted, in recognition of Omaha's generosity during that time. So that sense of reciprocity worked on an even larger scale as well. So these telegrams and messages and letters are pouring in, and Mayor Dahlman here is taking a photo op with his many letters and telegrams. And among this pile, there was a telegram from newly inaugurated President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had just been inaugurated on March 4th. At that time, inauguration took place in March, not in January like it does now. So he had been president for just a few weeks. His telegram was brief and in substance no different than many of the others received from other cities and individuals. Here's what it said. I am deeply distressed at news received from Nebraska. Can we help in any way? The end. Didn't say the end, but that was it. Wilson's offer was open-ended, and he put the next step firmly within Dahlman's control. This telegraph was widely printed in the city's newspapers, and so was Dahlman's response. Dahlman's response said, "We deeply appreciate your offer of aid, but I believe we can handle the situation. Our people are responding nobly. Major Hartman of Fort Omaha and his men came to our aid promptly and are doing great work. The people of Omaha are deeply grateful for your kind message of sympathy." The people of Omaha might indeed have been grateful for Wilson's sympathy, but as it quickly became apparent, they would have been even more grateful had they received some of the proffered aid. Victims and other observers criticized Dahlman's decision, and within days he had modified his refusal. Though Dahlman was the public face of the aid refusal fiasco, he had not acted alone. Several reports of Dahlman's response mention an apparently fateful meeting with the Commercial Club, one of the most prominent bastions of the business elite, as I mentioned earlier, where he was advised to turn down the offer of aid from Wilson. Contemporary observers in Omaha worried that the members of the Commercial Club thought that the negative publicity, supposedly negative, associated with accepting federal aid would damage Omaha's credit and ability to attract business and investment from other American cities. W.H. Green, a member of the Real Estate Exchange, which was another businessmen's association, charged the club with selfish interest, saying, "What right has any man, though he be rich, to say whether a poor man shall accept money from another city rather than go into debt for a new home or start paying rent again?" Another member of the exchange added, "Ask the man who lost everything if he would be too proud to accept money from another city, and see what he will say." Green and his associates' suspicions proved accurate. The executive committee minutes of the Commercial Club reveal that the club discussed the matter of federal funding relief explicitly, decided that outside funding should be refused, and that the reason for this stance was out of concern for Omaha's wider reputation in the national business world. It was decided that, for the present at least, Omaha businessmen take care of the relief situation, and that communications offering assistance should be answered, expressing appreciation for the offer of assistance, but stating that for the present at least, it would not be needed, the minutes summarized. They continued. This was after Mr. Moeller and Mr. Kelly and others had stated that Omaha's credit at the present time is at stake, that it is A1, and if she is able herself to take care of the situation, it will more firmly establish the city in the business world. So, Wilson was refused, Omaha appeared strong, the businessmen hoped, business might quickly resume as usual. But after speaking at the real estate exchange meeting, Green and other critics of Dahlman's refusal of federal aid took matters into their own hands. On April 2nd, representatives of various improvement clubs met to form their own resolution on the matter and protest the commercial interests. The Omaha Bee reported that Green was particularly severe in his criticism of the Commercial Club for, quote, the action taken in regard to soliciting relief from outside the city. Others echoed Green's concerns, and the group passed a resolution requesting $2 million of federal aid, specifically for the relief of small homeowners. The resolution noted that the damage was far in excess of the estimate, an opinion entertained for the first few days, that though Omahans had indeed responded liberally and willingly, they could not meet the burden on their own. It continued, believing that the government of the United States in its stand and rank for charity, benevolence, and Christian principles, and readiness to relieve distress, stands ready and willing to aid in part to retrieve the losses of its citizens through acts of God. This group of citizens sent their plea to their congressman in Washington, D.C. Back home in Omaha, the refusal was also lambasted by the editor of the Omaha World-Herald, who used his platform to condemn the decision. More important than local pride, dearer even than our credit ratings, are our suffering people, he wrote to his readers. And when their cries for help pierce the skies, every other consideration becomes secondary to the duty of relief that shall be as prompt as it is generous. He continued, it is not strange if some, who have failed to look again and yet again, have reached the satisfying but sadly mistaken conclusion that Omaha will easily and fully provide out of her own bounty for all of these stricken people. But it is, we repeat, a sad mistake. The sad mistake proved to be a bit of a PR embarrassment for the club, and by Thursday of that week, statements appeared in all of the daily papers, correcting the impression that it had discouraged the CRC from accepting outside donations that were freely given, and that Omaha was, in fact, very grateful for all of the donations from across the country. They're actually pretty wily, I think, in how they word this. They stop short of asking for more donations. They deny that they have ever requested any donations, but they also leave it open for if people want to send us money, we're okay with that. So they really kind of work themselves out of that spot pretty deftly there. It's obviously a thoughtfully constructed statement. But this refusal was not the only intervention the club made in the recovery process. Taking it as their personal mission to control the story of the storm sent across the country, the commercial club preferred to emphasize the, quote, pure gold of citizenship that animated Omaha's citizens in the days after the storm, rather than the destruction, loss, or suffering. In the official statement the club carefully prepared and issued to newspapers and commercial organizations across the country, the version on record steadfastly denied incidents of looting. Quote, before any disorder or looting could be attempted, the federal troops from Fort Omaha, under Major C.F. Hartman, were in charge of the situation, which was completely under control before daybreak Monday morning. The contrast between this version of events and the Omaha Daily News article and the World Herald articles depicting disobedient sightseers, looting, and overwhelmed law enforcement is pretty striking. Once again, the club's executive committee minutes reveal the behind-the-scenes enactment of this glowing report. The minutes read, after considerable discussion as to whether or not the catastrophe had been misrepresented in news reports that had been sent to the outside world, it was decided that it was proper that the commercial club should issue over the signatures of its president, vice president, and commissioner, same guys, a statement showing the true condition of affairs and basing an estimate on the total loss at $5 million and no more. It was suggested that this statement should mention the fact that the figures were unanimously approved at a well-attended meeting of the Executive and Public Affairs Committees of the Businessmen of Omaha. So they had this really planned out about how they were going to craft this official statement of the Omaha Tornado. Given the business elite's main concerns, which probably were the growth of Omaha and by extension their own business interests, neither the refusal of aid nor the whitewashed official story are difficult to understand. Omaha's downtown business district remained happily undamaged, and while they no doubt mourned the loss of life and the suffering occurring in their city, I want to emphasize that. I don't think they were monsters. I don't think that they were totally heartless to what was going on, so I don't want to imply that. I think they probably were quite sad by what they saw, and many of them were personally affected. But they also likely rejoiced at the opportunity to quickly resume business as usual. And in further fairness to them, they did have some reason to want to correct the story, as is still the case. Things get reported quickly, whether or not they're verified. That was happening in 1913 too. So see, some things are not different. And so some newspapers, had painted portraits of, thousands of people are dead, the city is wiped off the map, the downtown business is in shambles. So there was some misinformation out there in kind of the wider world that they legitimately were concerned about having the wrong information out there. So they weren't just paranoid. They were maybe a little paranoid, but they weren't totally paranoid that these misconstruals were around. So though the order of priority sounds cold, the men of the commercial club were not alone in looking out for the business concerns in the wake of the disaster. The editor of the Nebraska City Press gave voice to some of the reassurances that the businessmen of Omaha sought to advertise. Quote from the Nebraska City Press: "Eastern people who read about windstorms in Nebraska should not take it for granted that such things occur every day," reassured the editor. "The Omaha disaster is the very first that city has ever had." That's actually not true. I think they had one in the 1870s that damaged a church. Emphasizing the relative stability of Omaha as a desirable place to do business and the uncommon nature of the disaster, the editor added his finishing touch. "Unlike police scandals in New York, Nebraska tornadoes do not occur with sickening rapidity." The St. Louis paper also touched on business concerns, pairing a message of sympathy to the victims with commendation of Omaha's mastery of events and the reassurance that, quote, "there is nothing accidental in Omaha's growth and power, given its," quote again, "fine examples of self-reliance and capacity," a sentiment that was no doubt exactly what the commercial club was hoping for. In the end, as we all know, Omaha rebounded quite nicely. When I tell people that my dissertation focuses on a tornado in Omaha, they tend to assume that I'm talking about the one in 1975. It killed 3 people and caused an incredible amount of property damage. Probably a lot of you are familiar with that, remember that. But because this is the 100th anniversary of the 1913 tornado, there's been a little bit more information out there about it. Hopefully many of you caught the NETV special this spring. They had a very nice hour-long documentary about the storm that had a lot more details about what actually happened and some anecdotes from victims. But when you look at local histories or state histories, it's often given little more than a paragraph or a footnote, in spite of its, pretty substantial lethality. That's not just due to the passage of time and the forgetfulness of our memories. Omaha did recover relatively quickly from the storm, and the decimated sections of town were rebuilt. Some even profited from the tornado, as you might expect. Fewer than 10% of homeowners in Omaha carried tornado insurance policies on their homes in March 1913, though presumably the number was much higher soon after that. This is a page from, I guess it's 2 days after the storm. And this was not the only page in the paper like that. There's several pages, and this is true of all of the dailies. I think every insurance company in town right away was like, yes, more than just fire insurance. This is great. And so they were ready to profit off of the fear that people had from seeing the destruction. Souvenir books featuring photos of the tornado's destruction, or published independently or by the newspapers, sold briskly during the weeks after the storm. Perhaps they were bought by the same people who refused to follow the police's orders to move along. But the dominant narrative following the storm became less a remembrance of tragedy and more a celebration of victory. Later in 1913, the Omaha Bee published a booklet entitled "Wrecked in a Night, Rebuilt in a Day." Omaha after the tornado. Sounds familiar, right? I borrowed that one. I like the title. In it, dozens of side-by-side photos show wrecked residences immediately after the storm and their newly refurbished splendor 1 month later. So really, wrecked in a night, rebuilt in a month would have been more accurate, but not quite as catchy. Only 2 libraries in the country still have a copy of this publication. One, less surprisingly, is the University of Nebraska, Omaha. The other is Harvard University. Harvard has owned their copy since 1913 when, according to an inscription inside the cover, the Commercial Club of Omaha sent them a copy for their collection, apparently thoroughly committed to the goal of showing Omaha's resilience and rebound and getting that idea into the hands of East Coast power players. In April of 1914, a story appeared in the Wall Street Journal titled Omaha's Comeback. A thorough listing of the profits of nearly every industry in Omaha, the author, who I strongly suspect was connected to the commercial club in Omaha and probably submitted it, offers valuable food for thought, he claims, about the implications of the city's stunning prosperity in the wake of adversity. Quote, "The recuperative powers of the city, after such a heavy loss, is almost unbelievable." 1 year after the storm, the World Herald published a before and after retrospective very similar to Wrecked in a Night, Rebuilt in a Day. The brief foreword encapsulates the decision to remember the tornado as a triumph, not a tragedy. After the storm wreaked its wrath on rich and poor alike, Omaha's most reliable and responsible citizens sprang into action. Foreword says, "The relief of sufferers was astounding in its thoroughness, and the fact that the reconstruction was accomplished practically with outside financial aid is perhaps the biggest and finest feather Omaha was ever able to wear in its hat. Omaha handled her disaster in splendid fashion and is proven by the following pictures." The foreword concluded, "A great people met a great trouble and conquered." And that became kind of the story of the Omaha tornado and its recovery. Do you have any questions?
How many people were killed?
It's really hard when you look back at these disasters to find an exact number. It ranges from, I think the lowest I've seen is around 80 up to 170. I've been trying to keep a database of people I see listed as killed, and I've got around 130 in there. So usually I say over 100 is kind of my quick answer, but it's hard to know exactly how many. Back there.
Are there any sorts of data that would have existed in the months or immediate years afterwards that would paint a picture of what had changed before or after? And I don't have any idea what kind of data they kept, but anything that would have said anything about homeless or I don't know what, you know?
Right. That's a good historian question, change over time. I like that. It is hard to tell because you don't always know exactly what you're pinning down. You know, some of the things that might tell us that are hard to track down. Like, okay, so some of these people that didn't have the funds to rebuild, what happened to them? Did they move on? You know, like, was there a substantial portion of town that, you know, didn't rebuild? You know, maybe the Jewish community that got really hit around 24th and Lake didn't rebuild. So those things are somewhat hard to determine because while buildings were rebuilt, you don't know if it's the original owners who are rebuilding them. If people are moving, you don't know if that's a function of the storm or if that's a function of other life circumstances. It's a highly fluid time for people moving around. You know, so some of those things you don't know. I do think that there is an effort made to kind of paper over some of the negative changes at least by saying, you know, look, we had this horrible tornado and here's still how much new property was built and here's how much we made in the stockyards and things like that. And so I think you tend to see more evidence or more figures of things that didn't change negatively than you do here are some bad things that have happened and affected things later on. Did you have a question earlier? Okay.
I have a second one.
Okay.
The first one is about the number of people killed. I was just thinking about John's question and your response.
Mm-hmm.
Government collects a lot of data about different things, and we have it for a long time. I wonder if there would be property tax data available from back in those days, where you could look at property tax data for, let's just take a section of land that the tornado really clobbered. And I wonder if you could get assessed valuation and then look at it, say 5 years later. I was just trying to think of something that could be a measure, and that was one thing that struck me, assuming there were property taxes in those days.
Yeah, I don't know if there were or not. There are other ways, though, of tracking property. And, you know, it would take a lot of number crunching, but I think it is theoretically possible. The city directories at that time probably would be a good source as well. At that time, you could look up people, right? And it would say usually their occupation and also their address and also their telephone exchange if they had one. But you could also do the reverse lookup, and you could look up an address and find out who owned it. And so some of those things might, you know, if I wanted to sit there and go through the phone book, which I haven't yet, but probably would be interesting to be able to do that, you know, and see kind of if there's turnover or what on some of those addresses.
As I understand,
Mm-hmm.
you're writing your dissertation on this topic. What's the purpose of your study? What did you say the purpose of your study is?
The purpose of my study is I actually hope to expand it. This is a small portion of it. I want to look at kind of questions of responses to disasters. I'm really interested in the role of the state and the role of the federal government in responding to disasters. I'm also really interested, I didn't put any of this in here at all, in looking at how belief, like science and religious interpretation, influenced how people viewed storms and things like that. So ultimately, I think I'm going to end up making an argument about, you know, I feel like this is a pretty transitory time in American history, kind of, you know, maybe that sort of last moment before we decide that, okay, we as historians in this case decide, all right, this is now like the modern U.S., you know, pre-World War I. And so some of these ideas are really in flux, and I kind of want to see, you know, how does that look when it's sorting out a relatively insignificant, in the grand scheme of the world, I guess, disaster.
Your study is pretty much historical research.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mayor Dahlman had a corrupt reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And did he make this decision to turn down the federal aid personally? And could there have been some kind of personal hidden agenda?
Yeah, I didn't go very much into the machine here. I don't think that Jim Dahlman made the decision personally, because I thought maybe you did that intentionally because the boss was named Tom Dennison, so I thought maybe you conflated them. Aha, they're the same person. You know, so I don't think Dahlman made the decision personally, and the reason I don't think that is because I did find evidence of the commercial club deciding, like, okay, this is our rationale for not adopting it, and also people from the time period, the contemporary reports seem to indicate that they are blaming the commercial club. It's not conclusive proof, but I think the two together lead me to believe that that was probably less Dahlman and more business interests making that decision. But yeah, he did have a corrupt reputation insofar as he was run by a political machine. It's pretty common of cities at the turn of the century to have this this machine undergirding them, and Omaha was a part of that mentality. So, yeah, I don't know. Someone suggested at the panel in March that perhaps the machine didn't really want, you know, if there were strings that came with the federal money, such as federal oversight or investigations or follow-ups. You know, maybe that was why and the machine just didn't really want the federal government poking around, which, you know, that has some plausibility too. It's hard to prove, but yeah.
You know, not to be too much of a cynic about this, but we moved to Omaha in 1967. Mm-hmm. And if you take the top half of where the tornado went through, kind of makes you wonder if you were to do an in-depth study and simply look at the demographics and the values and such in Omaha, if that area ever recovered. Mm-hmm. Because it wasn't too far from a tornado looking then. Mm-hmm. And, you know, from leftovers. And I'm just kind of interesting to think about if you could evidence whether that area ever recovered. for the Gold Coast to recover, that
Mhm.
area in there around Jocelyn Castle, that's
Mhm.
kind of a no-brainer, because they have all the resources.
Right.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The part of Omaha that is poorer socioeconomically now, it does kind of echo that hardest hit area.
50 years ago, it was that way.
Right. So, it's hard to say, okay, is that because of the tornado, or is that because this has been an economically depressed area of the city for a while? I'm not sure I can assign causality, but you're right. It was certainly easier. The three large houses I showed you, or George Jocelyn, like, they can rebuild. They've got the money. Like, it's sad, but they're going to be fine. It's a lot harder for a community that's already poor and has just streets raised to recover from that.
I'm not familiar with Omaha, but your map showed that the tornado went through Bemis Park.
Mhm.
Is that still there, and what is the location of it?
I don't know if it's still there or not. I think it is there. I think it's a little smaller than the area on the map today. But I mean, I think a lot of those larger homes in that general area still exist. But I don't know much about, like, okay, I'm not an Omaha native, so I haven't spent a lot of time puttering around in that area to see what's still there and what's
What
not.
would be the street address about where the tornado started then?
Oh, about where it started. I'd have to look.
About 55th and Center Street.
Yeah, I mean, if you consider the west edge on that map I showed, I have a 1914 map that I kind of use when I'm comparing things, and it runs out to about 54th, 55th. That's far the west edge. That's the west edge of Omaha at that point. And you could see on that map, Dodge was pretty far down. So it certainly doesn't have the western sprawl like it does today.
Do you have any information on how people got money to rebuild?
I don't. I mean, I think that pre-insurance, it's a lot harder to determine. So if they had insurance, obviously that's what they did. The aid committee, they're going to cut off my tape, but the aid committee, looked into cases, tried to determine, oh, is this person worthy poor? Is this person worthy poor? They had a big preoccupation with that. I'd love to talk to you a little more about that afterward if you're interested, but they're giving me the wrap it up signal. So thank you very much for coming, and if you have questions, come talk to me afterward.